Joseph finally going to give up the goods here?
Yep, chapter 45. All right. Yep, this whole interaction's been going on for the last 3 chapters now, and as we move on to chapter 45, we'll find that Joseph finally can't contain himself and owns up to what the whole situation is about. All right. Verse 1 in chapter 45 says, Then Joseph, of course, this is after Judah has basically stood before him and begged for the life of Benjamin. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, Have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Now it's interesting at this point, and you can understand why in his political position, he didn't want any of the Egyptian officials or any of his slaves to see him become emotional. That would have been embarrassing. But obviously, and of course the Bible does not tell us this, but obviously he must have told them to leave these Hebrew brothers behind, otherwise they'd have ushered them out as well. But you got to wonder what they would be thinking at this point when Joseph just declared that the whole room needed to be cleared, but yet they were allowed to remain behind.
Ruh-roh.
Yeah. Kind of makes you wonder what's up at this point. Verse 2 says, He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Which tells you that when they left, they didn't clear out of the house. They probably just stepped out of the room, shut the door behind them, and left guards at the door. Now, look at it from the Egyptians' perspective. Joseph has just given them orders to vacate the room, and they don't know, other than maybe the chief steward. He probably knew what was going on, but the rest of them probably have no idea who these 11 Hebrews are, along with any slaves that they might have had with them that are allowed to remain behind. So, when he ran his slaves out, that they would have set up guard at the door. So when Joseph gets pretty much beside himself and emotional, they would have overheard all of this. And because he's the prime minister, well, as everybody knows, there is no such thing as a secret in Washington. I'm sure the same was true there as well. They probably beat feet to Pharaoh's throne to let Pharaoh know, by the way, your prime minister is entertaining some Hebrews, and we don't know what's going on, but he's upset over something. Verse 3, Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Now, I looked up this word that's translated, at least in my New American Standard, as dismayed. The Hebrew meaning behind that is not that they were dismayed. That's actually kind of an understatement. Pretty much at this point, they being the only ones left in the room, and Joseph now saying, Oh, I'm Joseph. The meaning behind this word is they were terrified.
Frantic.
Yeah, they were frantic at this point, because if they realize that the man we're standing in front of, who can order our execution with the mere flick of a finger, is the brother that we sold in slavery 30 years ago, you think they were a little nervous? Well, that's kind of the way you need to read this. They were beyond nervous. They were scared to death that Joseph's about to pull the wool over them. So,
Distraught would probably be a better word than dismayed.
Yeah, what's that?
Distraught.
Very much so.
Panic.
Panicked. Verse 4 says, And Joseph said to his brothers, Please come closer to me. Now, as he says this, notice none of the Egyptian officials or slaves are still in the room. So what does this tell you about what Joseph is doing at this point?
He's keeping the secret from them,
He's
but
making himself vulnerable.
Well, yeah, but he's no longer speaking through an interpreter.
oh,
He's now speaking Hebrew to them, which they probably had not heard him speaking the Hebrew language up until this point. To keep up the ruse, he'd been speaking through an interpreter all this time. And now, with nobody but them in the room, he's speaking to them in their native language. You think they're listening to his voice and thinking, man, it's been 30 years since I've heard that voice. If they recognized it. It says, Please come closer to me. And they came closer, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now, verse 4, whom you sold. You think they wanted to hear this? 30 years ago, and now he's reminding them, by the way, I'm not just Joseph, I'm the one you sold down the river. So now that he has reminded them of this, what do you think they're thinking?
we go to jail. We go to jail.
Oh, I would say that would be the least of their worries. They're probably more thinking we're on the way to the gallows. And now, do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. Now, this is the first they're hearing out of Joseph that might be some words of hope that he's not going to call in the executioner.
First signs of forgiveness.
First signs of forgiveness at this point. In fact, there's an interesting theological point behind this. You know, one of the things that any biblical student or student of theology learns about the Bible is it is a rare occasion to find one single reference to something in the Bible, especially between the Old and New Testament. If you find something in the New Testament, 99 times out of 100, there's a model or some kind of parallel or precedent for it in the Old Testament. Now, when Joseph here says, For God, you sold me here, but God sent me before you to preserve life. What does this remind you of any New Testament passage that this is the model for?
John the Baptist.
No.
It was like Judas with his 3 pieces of silver.
Jesus came.
All things work together for good to those who love the Lord. Now, this is your Old Testament precedent for that passage. What Joseph is saying is that you sinned. You intended to sell me into slavery, but God is the one that actually orchestrated the whole thing in order to bring about good in it. So when we see that passage in the New Testament that says all things work together for good to those that love the Lord, here's your Old Testament, model for that right here.
Is that Romans 8, like Romans 8:6 or something like that? I'm just wondering. Yeah.
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, I just. Yep.
Okay, verse 6. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Now, that passage right there tells us exactly how long this whole charade's been going on. That Joseph had been in Egypt 20 years when he was elevated to prime minister. You had 7 years of a good harvest, and now 2 years of this. So that's a total of 29 years that Joseph has been gone from them, plus however long it took the caravan to get to Egypt and sell him off to begin with. So Joseph was only 17 years old at the time. So that's why he invited him, said, get up a little closer where you can actually get a good look at me. Plus, at this point, do you think Joseph had to get out his rag or something and wipe some of the makeup off his face so they could,
To look Hebrew again?
yeah, to look a little Hebrew again? Because he probably, again, as an Egyptian official, he would have been clean shaven. Very good possibility he shaved his head. So they would, it'd be easy to see how they didn't recognize him. And of course, Benjamin wouldn't recognize him because Benjamin was just a baby at the time. Now, it's interesting all this time, we're not told a whole lot about what Benjamin did. Benjamin's probably just standing here wondering, what do you mean you sold my big brother into slavery?
Yeah, he's probably just learning for the first time.
Exactly. Because this is the part,
I'm sure they never told him.
we're never told anything about, what happened to Benjamin and all this. Jacob thought he was killed by an animal. Since Benjamin was just a baby, Benjamin's already looking around and go, wait a minute. If this guy's my big brother, what do you mean you sold my brother into slavery? You think Benjamin's got a few issues of his own to deal with at this point? This is the first time, at least, not to say it's the first time he's seen Joseph, but this is the first time he's seen Joseph and knows this is my big brother. All right. So it's been 2 years. There's still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, once again, here's another Old Testament precedent. How many times do we see throughout the Bible the concept of the Hebrew remnant? This is the first time we've actually got a biblical reference to it. That throughout Hebrew and Jewish history, they get involved in sin. God judges them. They get weeded, God weeds them out, whittles them down to a remnant, and then grows them up again. That concept of saving a remnant goes all the way back to here. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now, the question is, how long did it take Joseph to come to that realization?
Wait a minute.
Probably a while.
The concept of the remnant goes all the way back to the flood, doesn't it?
Well,
Doesn't it start at the flood?
Well,
but that's not what I said.
preserved.
I said the concept of a remnant with the Jews.
Okay. They weren't Jews at the flood.
No.
All right. But that was the first time God saved a remnant.
But yes, you're right. This is not the first time the concept of a remnant is seen, but this is the first time the remnant with regard to the Jewish people.
Okay. I'm good with that.
You're okay with that? Minor detail.
I wonder how long it did take him to come to this conclusion.
Also, look back at the time as right after Joseph had been elevated to prime minister. Notice one of the first things that we're told, and this is a couple of chapters back when we studied this, that Joseph mulls to himself, and maybe he's discussing this privately between him and God, that you as in he's addressing God, have put me in a position where I can forget my past, forget my family. Joseph wanted originally to completely wipe, burn the bridges and wipe out any memory and forget his family back in Canaan. Obviously, at that point, he is not thinking God put me here to save Jacob's family.
He has no idea
wanted,
at that point what God's plan is.
he wanted to forget Jacob's family
Yeah.
because he thought, my brothers put me here.
This will help me do it now.
And now, God's been gracious enough to get me out of that, and I can forget Jacob and his family. So we've come from that 7 years later to a point where now he realizes this whole thing was orchestrated by God to save Jacob's family. Obviously, Joseph has done a little spiritual growing of his own in the last few years.
I bet you he probably didn't come to this conclusion until he realized his brothers had changed.
And that's a good possibility. You have to wonder, the first time he saw his brothers and they walk in the door, it might have been, say, a year earlier on the first trip to buy food. Is that the point at which he realizes, maybe this is why God put me here to begin with?
He's had 9 years to think about why God gave him that vision to begin with, that prophecy to begin with. Why did God bless me in this way? What am I supposed to do with this? He's had 9 years to think about that.
So, but obviously he has grown some in his own respect, that now that he's middle-aged, got a little, some experience and wisdom behind him, he realizes that as much as I might have wanted to forget about them, that's the reason God put me here to begin with. And so he's now extending an olive leaf, so to speak, to his brothers and saying, you've been forgiven. Yeah, you might have intended this, but it's God that orchestrated the whole thing to begin with. So point being is, if he wanted to get mad with somebody, he'd get mad with God. And I guess that's another theological point that a lot of us need to learn to deal with, is no matter what happens in our life, because of the fact the Bible tells us that all things work together for good, it's no matter whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, or whatever, you cannot escape the inescapable conclusion that good, bad, or otherwise, if God didn't outright cause it, God at least allowed it to happen.
Probably what your son's struggling with more than anything right now.
There's a purpose behind it that you just can't comprehend.
Purpose behind everything, you just may not be seeing it yet. And the other thing is, you figured if it took Joseph 7 or 8 years to come to that conclusion, God's patient. God is, I guess, an expert in just sitting back and waiting for us to come to the right conclusion.
For our little tantrums and everything along the way.
Anyway, God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Now, clearly, Joseph is not Pharaoh's father. He's not a father figure to Pharaoh. And in fact, I'd venture to say Joseph is probably a good bit younger than Pharaoh. But when he says that God has made me a father to Pharaoh, that was a Hebrew euphemism that basically means I'm his chief advisor. I'm the one giving advice to Pharaoh, which that would be a true statement. But the interesting thing is, where I find a rather amusing historical parallel in all of this, is the second thing that he says. God's made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his household. When have we seen that before?
Potiphar.
Exactly. He was lord of Potiphar's household until Potiphar threw him in prison. And now, lo and behold, he's now head honcho of Pharaoh's household. I have to wonder, Potiphar is simply gone from the scene at this point. But I have to wonder, did Potiphar completely fall out of favor? Or is it just that he's just not a part of the story at this point? But if he is still the chief bodyguard, you got to wonder if Potiphar walked very carefully around Joseph, thinking that the guy that was my former slave can call for my execution by the, a single word.
I got a different impression. I think he and Potiphar probably got along fine. I think Potiphar was forced into doing what he had to do to placate his wife.
And that
He
may
didn't have any
be.
animosity toward Joseph.
And that may be.
But he probably knew the truth.
But look at it from Joseph's perspective.
He still
That
got sent and
didn't
put in prison.
that didn't make Joseph's life any easier. He still put Joseph in prison for something that, and in fact, I would say, if I were Joseph, that would make me that much madder that you threw me in prison when you knew I didn't do it.
What about Potiphar's wife?
Yeah.
Now she's
Yeah.
the one, yeah.
Exactly.
I wonder if Potiphar kept her or not.
She's the one who ought to be walking on eggshells.
You have to wonder if at some point, because you know, if Potiphar was the chief bodyguard, Potiphar and Joseph crossed paths. And you got to wonder if at some point Joseph called Potiphar in and said, "Now, Mr. Potiphar, you know I didn't do what you accused me of. And by the way, your wife and I, we got a little bone to pick." That would be an interesting conversation.
I don't think he got invited to too many banquets with his wife.
Yeah. All right. Said, anyway, Lord of all his household and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, "Thus says your son Joseph." By the way, have you noticed that even though Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name, other than the one time we're told what that name was,
Never used.
throughout this entire narrative, from beginning to end, he's never actually introduced by that name. Now, our common sense tells us that probably to the Egyptians, when they were speaking their native language, that's probably the name they used. But as this was relayed to Moses, and Moses, committed all this to writing here in the book of Genesis, not once except that one time does he ever use Joseph's Egyptian name. It's always just Joseph.
Hebrew first.
Yep.
Well, this is a story about the Hebrews.
Well, and that's true. But anyway, go up to my father. Why go up?
Because it was north.
Yeah. Canaan's about 200 or 300 miles north of there. Go up to my father and say to him, "Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay." Now, why do you think Joseph is in a hurry for him to get down there? I can think of 3 reasons.
The famine and the dad's old.
There's 2 out of 3 reasons right there. The famine is ongoing, and Joseph knows it's not going to end anytime soon. He knows his dad's old, but there's one other reason.
Wants to save him from the pain of having lost his son.
He hadn't seen his dad in 30 years. So,
I'm curious to know what the brothers are going to say to Dad.
Yeah.
I mean, how did Joseph become the ruler of Egypt when he was torn apart and killed by wild animals?
He got away.
And
He must have gotten away, Dad.
well, let's look at that. All right, they can feign ignorance on this and say, "Well, we just found his coat. We don't know what happened." But
When he gets down to Egypt and Joseph tells him the truth.
there's still one other rock on the table they got to deal with. Benjamin.
Yeah.
Because if they get back and say, "Oh, by the way, we found Joseph and he's still alive," and Dad said, "Well, I thought he got tore up by the animal, or the lion got him or whatever," and they're all saying, "Oh, I don't know," and Benjamin's sitting there in the back saying, "Wait a minute."
what was this talking
Joseph
about
said,
selling?
"I heard Joseph say you sold him into slavery." I bet that went over real interesting. Unless you got to wonder if somewhere along the trip they said, Benjamin,
Please.
keep your mouth shut, and we'll make sure you're well taken care of. Or keep your mouth shut, or we will take care of
The
you
scheming
too.
probably never stopped.
Yeah. Yeah. Sibling rivalry probably did not stop. And, now surely, you know that they have changed at this point, but one way or the other, they still got one other confrontation, as you just said, when they see Jacob, that either Benjamin's going to rat him out, or they got to somehow convince Benjamin to keep his mouth shut.
See
Dad,
what
you
happened.
won't believe what God did.
Yeah. All right, verse 10 says, "And you shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me." Now, interesting thing about verse 10. Now, the land of Goshen, as most of you know, is the northeastern part of the Nile Delta. It was a swampy area, but considerably more fertile, certainly at this point in time when there's a famine going on, than the rest of Egypt. One of the important reasons for this area is, well, Jacob and his brood still have a whole bunch of cattle. I mean, they're ranchers and herdsmen, and they're not going to just abandon all of this cattle in Canaan. They're bringing them with them. And if they go to any other part of Egypt that is in the midst of a famine, where's all those herds going to graze? Probably the grass is dead, nothing's growing. The only fertile area left in Egypt is the Nile Delta, where there's still water from the river itself. Now, the interesting part of this particular issue, when Joseph promises them they'll live in Goshen, this is before Pharaoh offered the land to them. Joseph is taking it upon himself at this point to offer that land to them. Now, that doesn't mean Joseph doesn't have the authority to do it. Clearly, Pharaoh's given him the authority. But my point is that this is being done on Joseph's authority. Pharaoh's got nothing to do with it at this point. But he's offering them one of the few areas in Egypt that's left that's still fertile.
Plus, the Egyptians wouldn't want anything to do with them again because they're ranchers and shepherds and everything else.
Yeah, that's another thing that we're going to see shortly, is that Egyptians despised ranchers and herdsmen, because while Egyptians were not vegetarians, they would eat, lamb and, chicken, things of that sort. Egyptians did not eat steak. They considered a cow a sacred animal. So when Jacob comes down there with a whole herd of cattle, that's one of the reasons why we will see later on, in chapter 46, that Joseph tries to convince them, to kind of don't really own up right off the bat to what it is you do for a living, because the Egyptians don't like it. Of course, first thing that we know that Jacob did is do the exact opposite of what Joseph told him. But that we'll hold off of that for another week or so. But yeah, the Egyptians did not like ranchers. They considered shepherds and ranchers to be the dregs of society. And by the way, notice also that even to the Hebrews generations later, shepherds were considered second-class citizens, which I think is one of the reasons why, who were the first people that God made the annunciation of the birth of Christ to? The shepherds. The dregs of society.
He sent Moses out for 40 years as a shepherd, too.
Yep.
He who is last shall be first.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's go a couple more verses and we'll call it quits for the night. Anyway, it says, tell him to come down to me, do not delay, and you shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. Therefore, I will also provide for you For there are still 5 years of famine to come, lest you and your household and all that you have be impoverished. All right, we'll pick up at verse 12 on Sunday. But notice Joseph is telling his brothers, don't just go get Jacob and bring the family down. Bring everything down, and I will provide for you. Now, in view of the fact that there are still 5 years of famine yet to go, this is a major undertaking, because Joseph knows that unless something drastic has happened, Joseph knows that his dad's got a lot of cattle, and that's a lot of grazing land and a lot of food to provide, which I don't think that that's really that much of a promise on Joseph's part. I think what it tells us is that apparently in the 7 years of plenty, Joseph was able to set aside enough. He knows there is food aplenty in Egypt.
He also knows that they're not going to survive for 5 more years in Canaan.
Absolutely. But see, notice yeah, and that's the issue. He said, if you don't come, you're going to be impoverished, which is a fancy way of saying you're going to starve. But it's just the fact that if Joseph knows his dad's got lots of slaves, big family, lots of cattle, lots of sheep, and brings them down, that tells you that Joseph apparently is confident that there's a lot of food set aside in Egypt. A lot. Questions this evening?
Do you think Joseph had any idea? He must have had some idea that they'd be there for an extended period of time. I mean, not just the famine. And when he passed, he told them, take my bones up and bury them in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering how much insight he had into what the future was going to be.
Well, God had told Abraham that his descendants would in fact go to Egypt and they would be enslaved there for 400 years. I can't help but think that Abraham would have passed that information down to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob, that the family knew this would happen, which may also tell you why Jacob might have been so hesitant to go to Egypt if he had in fact been told your family is going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, until he finds out whether you're being invited to Egypt by your long lost son. And that would have been what it took to convince him to go to Egypt, which again kind of is one more piece in the puzzle as to why did God orchestrate all these events in that way. But that God knew that that's what it would take to get Jacob to go to Egypt, short of God just putting his finger on Jacob and say, you are going.
You alluded to something coming up of Joseph counseling Jacob about how to behave with the Egyptians and Jacob ignoring and
We'll
doing
see that in the
exact
next
opposite.
chapter.
So Jacob was where this whole stiff neck thing started?
Good possibility, because Jacob did the exact opposite of what Joseph told him to do. Now, we won't get that to Sunday, but probably this time next week we'll see it. All right. Anybody else? All right.